fundamental question of our time is whether the West has the will to survive. Do we have the confidence in our values to defend them at any cost? Do we have enough respect for our citizens to protect our borders? Do we have the desire and the courage to preserve our civilization in the face of those who would subvert and destroy it?
That was former United States President Donald Trump, delivering a speech in Krasinski Square in Warsaw in July 2017. Coming against the background of earlier similar appeals, which yearned to link identity, order, and force, this statement was not merely limited to the American president. Rather, with such perceptions increasingly spoken by leaders around the world, it was more of a sign of the times. Welcome back to Identity Hunters. My name is Kemal Mohamedou, and I will be exploring some of the causes, forms, and consequences of the global rise of neo-authoritarianism. Since about the early to mid-2010s onwards, our world has arguably been experiencing a renewal of authoritarianism and violent nationalism. In different parts of the world, under different systems, and at the hands of different leaders, the familiar practice of authoritarian politics has been reinvigorated and arguably updated. The world had known the practice of authoritarianism throughout the 20th century, notably in Europe, with fascism in the 1930s, or in many post-colonial states after the 1960s. So far, with the jungle growing back, as Robert Kagan put it, the liberal international order and its Western powers have stood mostly silent in the face of this trend, which has been gaining steady momentum over the past decade and has accelerated significantly since 2016 with the election of President Trump and his international imprint and legacy. This development has played out around the world and featured the promotion of autocratic norms and increasingly explicit infringements on the rules of the international system, including violations of sovereignty and annexation of territories, as seen in the actions of Russia and Crimea in 2014 and Ukraine most recently in 2022. This evolution of international politics has been propelled forward by the actions of heads of state and political leaders in senior national positions, which has thus raised a number of questions about the influence and lasting consequences of such negative leadership, notably on democracy. The return of authoritarianism has, importantly, played out both at the level of major powers and at the level of lesser regional actors, thus illustrating its rising systemic nature, starting in the case of some since the late 2000s. However, in addition to Donald Trump in the United States, Vladimir Putin in Russia, or Xi Jinping in China, the trend is visible globally. Indeed, similar neo-despotic leaders have risen across Europe, Asia, the Middle East, and Latin America, with authoritarian leaders such as Viktor Orban in Hungary, Giorgia Meloni in Italy, Rodrigo Duterte in the Philippines, Abdel Fattah el-Sisi in Egypt, Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia, Recep Tayyip Erdogan in Turkey, and Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil. In sub-Saharan Africa, several long-standing autocrats have been able to extend their hold on power during the same period, notably Yoweri Museveni in Uganda or Idriss Déby in Chad, who was replaced by his son in 2021. The 2022 Varieties of Democracy report highlights the democratic decline that the world has been experiencing across the past couple of decades. That report noted that, quote, the level of democracy enjoyed by the average global citizen in 2021 is down to 1989 levels. The last 30 years of democratic advances are now eradicated, end quote. Additionally, whilst the report further found that, quote, electoral autocracy remains the most common regime type and harbors 44% of the world's population, end quote, it should be noted that the very nature of autocracy is observed as being codified anew. The recent decline of democracy noted above has been accompanied by a form of authoritarianism which rehearses these classical traits while expanding on them, notably by making them more complex and more insidious as they can parade as a form of democratic advancement. For instance, in the guise of the defense of the threatened identity, as seen in the aforementioned statement by former President Trump. Against this background and such, quote, critical mass, we may ask what factors triggered this evolution. Massimiliano Tomba observes that, quote, neo-authoritarianism has neither fascist black shirts nor the Nazis' brown shirts, end quote. Indeed, the cliched classical forms of authoritarianism, whereby leaders attempted to project their rule through bureaucracy with a close focus on propaganda, are no longer sought after. In recent years, we have witnessed a regenerated type of authoritarianism, which was born because of several factors, including the transformation of communication channels and mutual support discourse. Neo-Authoritarianism features prominently upgraded and more sophisticated mechanisms and forms of communication. That is, communication not only with the people, but also with other despotic leaders across the globe. Today, authoritarian leaders often speak highly of each other and are more astute in their use of language, adopting a more subdued style while enforcing equally undemocratic measures. Such discourse was effectively illustrated by former President Trump in 2019. Upon waiting for a meeting with Egyptian President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi at the G7 summit, Trump commented publicly, quote, "Where's my favorite dictator?" Another example includes Trump stating in 2018 that he and Russian President Putin could get along well. Quote, "I think I could have a very good relationship with Russia and with President Putin, and if I did, that would be a great thing." End quote. Such language is highly indicative of the friendly relationships that authoritarian figures have been building with each other across the globe, and constitutes a key factor of the revivification of authoritarianism. Another factor that accounts for the rise of neo-authoritarianism is the feeling of loss many individuals are feeling in the increasingly multicultural and globalized societies where such neo-authoritarianism is playing out. Author Seymour Martin Lipset wrote that, quote, "A low level of sophistication and a high degree of insecurity predispose an individual towards an extremist view of politics." Indeed, many of the population groups that compose the majority of the supporter and voter base of figures like Marine Le Pen and Éric Zemmour in France, Boris Johnson in the United Kingdom, Donald Trump in the US, and Giorgia Meloni in Italy, easily play into the game of these neo-authoritarian figures who enjoy creating strong narratives by speaking of the good old days and recalling and reviving national myths and values of the past. Such examples include Trump's "Make America Great Again" or Zemmour's "Pour que la France reste la France," so that France remains France. They appeal to the sense that there was once a golden age in their sovereign state and hint at the idea that there is a degradation of culture led by foreigners, youth, environmentalists, feminists, ethnic or religious minorities, or in effect anyone who is seeking to alter the specific narrative of a nation which they regard as being beneficial to their interests. One of the forms that global authoritarianism takes, and possibly a wholly new effect of this aspect of authoritarianism, is that the same domestic appeals of authoritarianism in a given country are easily globalized, and, as such, many conservative ideals of social malaise generated by a sense of general fear can become exported across the globe. This is in fact paradoxical, since neo-authoritarianism is thus globalized authoritarianism, when its followers bemoan globalization. One such example is the case of France, where the former polemical journalist turned presidential candidate, Éric Zemmour, modeled his 2021-2022 campaign on the example of former US President Trump. Zemmour had drawn direct parallels between himself and Trump in his last book, La France n'a pas dit son dernier mot. France has not said its last word, and made several inflammatory remarks on social issues such as immigration, religion, and national identity in France. The consequence of this is that such process fundamentally constitutes a weakening of democracy internationally, as both these actors in different settings are working to weaken the value of democracy by using similar populist and authoritarian discourse. The expanding notion of political crisis and the parading of these autocratic norms as a response to globalization is indeed an insidious way to strengthen authoritarianism, as it is pitting population groups against each other, and ultimately eating away at the fabric of society, whilst allowing for autocrats to cast themselves as beleaguered defenders of the nation against these staged issues, incidents, threats, and often drawn-up rivals. Commenting on this, Tomba notes that neo-authoritarian forces, quote, "strengthen the power of big government in the name of security, invent an enemy to re-solidify the social fabric and create a sense of common identity. They make individuals more scared and insecure in order to sell them protection and security. Another form of the globalization and promotion of autocratic norms is that as authoritarian figures continue to echo each other's views, where they other entire population groups on the basis of religion, migration, or economic class, the movement is able to gain legitimacy through mimetism and repetition. By repeating these narratives in different corners of the globe, the main target population groups might find comfort in knowing that there are others elsewhere that share their struggle against the associated evils of globalization. This upgraded and reinvented type of authoritarianism that the world has been witnessing for the past decade or so has had one main consequence, namely the endangerment of democracy. This process is playing in many forms. First, neo-authoritarian leaders are speaking a demagoguery language which ultimately starts escaping the normal and acceptable boundaries of democratic exchange. Name-calling and violence-advocating leaders such as Brazilian President Bolsonaro, U.S. former President Trump, or former Philippines President Duterte end up normalizing ways of unacceptable politics, and in effect, directly or indirectly, socializing others into such democratic drift. Normalized autocrats have also then to be dealt with problematically by other statesmen following changes of administration, as became the case with Egypt's Sisi and Trump's successor in the United States, President Joe Biden. Additionally, whilst they do not operate as a strict bloc, nor have an explicit ideology which bonds them beyond their right-wing bent, these leaders are not only promoting autocratic norms, but in doing so, are also creating an alternative to the liberal international order for themselves, where they will be able to continue to trade and engage in negotiations with one another. Neo-autocrats are creating a sense of impunity for themselves. One such example of this point is when President Trump refused to endorse the CIA assessment of the personal responsibility of Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman in the October 2018 assassination of the Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi in the Saudi consulate in Istanbul. The rulers of the autocratic regimes seem to care less and less about the consequences of their actions on the international scene. They are unconcerned whether other actors, including major powers, view them with concern or if they impose sanctions on them. Witness the case of Russian President Putin and his February 2022 invasion of Ukraine, as they know that whatever finances they might lose due to sanctions will be made up for by their wealthy allies. Anne Applebaum exemplifies this element of autocratic impunity well with the case of Venezuela, as she notes that, quote, since 2008, the U.S. has repeatedly added more Venezuelans to personal sanctions list. Since 2019, U.S. citizens and companies have been forbidden to do any business there. Canada, the EU, and many of Venezuela's South American neighbors maintain sanctions on the country. And yet, Nicolás Maduro's regime receives loans as well as oil investment from Russia and China. Turkey facilitates the illicit Venezuelan gold trade. Cuba has long provided security advisors as well as security technology to the country's rulers. Observing the contemporary rise of neo-authoritarianism, we can conclude that ultimately, autocrats are creating the right conditions for themselves to succeed. Neo-authoritarian leaders are pushing for a transition and shift away from democracy, multilateralism, and cooperative security. They are encouraging international law transgressing and accountability within their nations. They are doing so while praising those others, like them, who promote and blend loose values such as nationalism, protectionism, spheres of influence, and what John G. Eckenberry dubs, quote, regional great power projects, end quote. Whether this is a passing development in world history or a staying one remains to be seen. Thank you.